My name is Heather Hughes. I am the Trust Lead Professional for Humanities. And within this session, I'm going to be discussing with you the role and the purpose of trips within history. So if you bear with me, I'm just going to put up a PowerPoint. So it starts there. And as a history teacher, I was a history lead for 15 plus years. Now I'm a faculty lead for humanities at Aldridge, but have run many trips and have been on many trips, and I'm a great advocate for trips. But the idea is that we're going to talk about, making it a little bit more meaningful. So I did not know this, so I've obviously done a bit of research in preparation for this CPD session. And looked at, well, when did school trips actually begin? We're all historians, we're quite interested in these sorts of things. So back in 1895, there was a code that was put together that permits children to visit museums and galleries in school hours. And this obviously gathered momentum. It's something that is quite normal now to be putting together. And then the second piece of information there was the role of World War I, and how places such as City of Manchester had school buildings actually requisitioned for hospitals for returning soldiers. And therefore, pupils had to go into a shift system to enter their school. So for half of the time, they actually were outside of school premises. And museums were one of those places that were being used as space for non-school based teaching. And and now we've moved on, obviously, but we still see it as very important, and learning outside of the classroom is quite a big agenda now. There are lots of aspects to why school trips, history trips, are of value. An obvious one is linked to cultural capital. And I think it's quite important, depending on your school context, for children, if they can, to get that sort of experience. You've got there a quote from Heather King talking about how museums are exclusionary places if you're not white and middle class. And there is that element to, in that case, museums, but you could say that about a lot of historical sites. Ofsted talk about cultural capital as essential knowledge, and that needs to be used for educating citizens, for introducing them to the best that has been thought and said, and to give this idea of understanding, of appreciating, human creativity, human achievement. And I think a lot of our history trips allow that to take place and allow that to be facilitated. How do Ofsted think about cultural capital? It's been described by them as a golden thread rather than an actual expectation. Amanda Spielman talked about cultural capital as being woven through everything that you teach. It is there. Sometimes it is more obvious, it is more explicit, but it should be there. And for I would hope for all of us, it is there within our curriculums and our teaching, and how we work with our young people. I've taken sort of two separate little comments there. And I'm sure that I'm teaching, grandma to suck eggs, and I'm sure that some of you will have run trips, some of you have been on trips, and considering and putting together trips and visits. A study from Hull University talked about how the impact of a very simple, very basic field visit, particularly if parts of it can be child-led, have an impact, significant impact on obviously knowledge and literacy skills. This was about science, but it doesn't really need to be about science. It could be about any of our subjects. And it talked about how on average, children who undertook fieldwork activities actually achieved higher literacy scores than children that did not. A report put together some years ago, but by Learning Outside the Classroom, talked about when planned and implemented well, learning outside the classroom contributes significantly to raising standards and improving pupils' personal, social and emotional development. And I think particularly over the last few years where lockdown and COVID came in, dominated our lives, dominated children's lives, where they spent a lot more time within the family unit, within their own home, this idea of opening up the doors again, this idea that we now, fingers crossed, can move into a future where, that's not going to necessarily be the case, where we can start to plan things and we can start to get children out of that classroom, get them talking with each other, get them looking at things that perhaps, we can't access in a classroom, and just seeing each other as well in a different context. There are always concerns with trips, and I am well aware of that and have spent many hours prepping and planning and trying to ward off some of these concerns. But I think it's important that we take these into account, we bear these in mind. Um, they do take up a lot of time. They can become a burden. The paperwork, the risk assessments, putting it on to Evolve, having parental meetings, chasing up monies, chasing up students who haven't brought back in certain parts of a consent form. It is it's like a time hoover in a way. It just sucks a lot of the time that you have when you're obviously busy with lots of other things. The classic school calendar issue: when can the trip take place? The classic time of year would be the end of the year, but does that actually work? And it might well be that you're having to have negotiations with the person responsible for school calendar, with the SRT, over this one. Suitable staff. Do you need to take specific TAs? Do you want to take a member of staff who's particularly knowledgeable about that particular place or that particular time? And is it actually going to work? Can you get those people out of school on that day? Are they available? Teachers have very limited, perhaps, ideas on visits for CPD. Sorry, have limited ideas when it comes to educational visits because of the lack of CPD. I know a lot of schools, you have either compulsory meetings if you want to start running trips, or there are advisory meetings or CPD, but it tends to be on the sides of admin, how to fill the forms in, what you should be looking for, the idea that the paperwork, the signing off on that is very important. But there is the other side to trips. There is the other side to visits. It's, how can I get the most out of it? How do I aim it at particular students? Is this the right sort of place? There is information out there. I mean, I've been looking at it when I was preparing for this, but we don't tend to try and access that. We access the other side, the paperwork side, the admin side. And so we often have very little in the way of this sort of pedagogy. We are driven by making sure that everything is in place from a sort of a logistics side. This is from a lead teacher of a school. His name is Jordan Hobbis, and he put together an MA on field visits within schools. And it's the last one, and it's the one that, even our colleagues will say to us if they know that we are going to be away on a trip, particularly perhaps a residential or a foreign trip, that they are for student-teacher, student-student relationships, but they are, and this is the word that I've heard used, they are a jolly. Hobbes talks about how it's quite an alarming attitude that a lot of teachers actually hold, and that, the main benefit is that it's going to be fun. Well, of course it should be fun. Of course it should be, but there should be more to it. Particularly at the moment, we are living at a point where things are so expensive for ourselves, but obviously for parents. These trips need to be of value monetarily, but they need to be of value for that student's knowledge or skill set or some form of development, not just this idea, well, we all get on better. They should be something that is very much aiding us with our curriculums, with our assessments. It's seen as curriculum, and not the classic word up at the top of the screen as a jolly. What I've tried to do is use some experience. As I say, I've run trips for, I don't know, 15, 20 odd years, 20 odd years probably now. I've done the classic sort of days out, Black Country Museum, Bliss Hill, and so on, coursework trips. Quarry Bank Mill, if any of you been there, all these sorts of trips. I've done a lot of foreign trips and residential trips. Been on trips sort of outward bounds in mid Wales. Did a number of trips to Italy, to Rome, back when we used to cover Medicine Through Time. Done trips to Berlin and so on. So I've had a lot of experience in running field visits, and I just wanted to pull a few thoughts together. I think the first thing, particularly now, is thinking about, have you, if possible, and as closely as you can, built it into your curriculum? Are you going to be putting lessons in beforehand? Now, I know you might be thinking, but not all of the students are going. And it very much, I know, depends on the trip. But there needs to be something beforehand rather than they just go to that place. Particularly for day visits, key stage 3 visits. Have you really thought about, why are the students on that visit? What do I want them to learn? And how am I going to get that across to them before they go, so that they're prepared? So that when they arrive, they've either got the idea about what sort of questions should I be asking the people that work there or that are volunteering there. What should I be looking out for? So they really suck out from that trip as much as possible. Is it worth putting together some kind of materials that the students will use while they're there? Would it be producing some tailor-made booklet? Some of the places that we visit do produce their own materials, and they might be great, but they might not be. It might be you've got to take parts from what materials a site might give you in advance, or it might be that you think about, well, actually, for my students, I want to produce something that guides them to particular places and to particular thoughts while we're there. Third point is this idea about send students. There is nothing wrong with actually phoning or emailing and talking to wherever you're going to be taking your students in advance. So thinking about what sort of resources they might have available, and perhaps talking through what the students are going to be looking at and seeing, perhaps setting up the idea that, this party might have quite a heavy amount of SEND students, or we're going to be grouping some students with their TAs, and thinking about making the trip as accessible to them as well. British Museum, for example, they offer loads of sort of facilities and support, students with access needs, with learning needs, mobility. And it's worth asking these places, what have you got in place? Have you got any materials? Particularly if you're looking at making booklets, would your SEND students actually really benefit from you putting something together to guide them? And perhaps as well thinking about what materials you're going to share if there are TAs that are going to support those students as well. Pre-visits. Pre-visits are brilliant. Particularly if you are running your first trip, or particularly if you are even sort of rethinking a trip that other staff have done in the past, but it's new to you. It's not always possible. You might not have the time. Logistically, it might just not work out for you. But I would really recommend going, having a look around, even if you've been there some years ago, I don't know, with your family or on your own. I know that some years ago, we took the whole of year 7 to Warwick Castle. And I've been before, but I thought, no, I want to go from a different point of view. I want to go as a teacher before Warwick Castle has, you know, hundreds of children appearing for their day there, and it really does help. You know, working out, right, where are the loos, working out, right, I need to divide this group of students up so they could go to that place, they could go to that place. It is really, really useful if you can do it. And then sort of as you get closer, some of the sort of the nuts and bolts, when you're talking to parents, when you have that parental meeting, and I'm talking really about residentials now in particular, be clear about what you want the children to take. Don't assume that parents and carers are on the same wavelength as you. And actually, on a day trip, be clear what the students be wearing, particularly their feet. I have found footwear can be, you know, some of their ideas on suitable footwear are quite odd, to be honest. So be really clear about, in this case, about clothing, but I very much went down the line after a couple of early trips that were organised. Don't assume parents know what you mean. Give examples. If you know, um, make sure they understand. Um, with that pre-visit meeting that we often do on residentials with parents, make it really, really clear. Let them have a handout they can take away. And even to the point where, and it's not, I don't think it is patronizing, but even to the point where if you know, put in some pictures of what you're talking about, if clothing or footwear, really reinforce those key points, because there is nothing worse than a student on a residential complaining that their feet are aching. They've got blisters because they've got a brand new pair of shoes that, you know, they bought for the trip, and they never broke them in. All these little things that can actually make or break it. You know, you can ask a student, what did you think about the trip? And all they can remember is the fact that their feet killed them, as opposed to the fact that, I don't know, they walked through the Sistine Chapel. The costings. Now that's, I think, a particularly sensitive area at the moment. I have always tried to, in the past, when running a residential trip, keep the price as low as possible. And I think it's getting more and more obviously difficult at the moment with the cost of living crisis and fuel prices. And therefore, what I would suggest is, if you can plan that trip as much in advance as is humanly possible, so that you give parents and carers that as long as possible to pay the balance through installments. You know, think about, is it manageable? I know in the past I thought to myself, there will be a certain point on this trip where if the price goes past that, I'm stopping doing it, because I don't think it's fair. And obviously, a lot of students, you're not the only trip that they will be asking their parents to pay for. And also perhaps thinking, you know, are there cheaper alternatives? Do they have to go to that specific place? Do you need to be a bit more creative with your thinking? Sharing information with the staff that are going. Have you shared it, or have you just assumed, well, they've done trips before, so they know that they'll know? Risk assessments, them having a physical copy or them having an electronic copy, being clear on what you expect of them. You're not being bossy, you're just making sure everyone knows before you go, so you don't have to say these things. You know, corridor duties in an evening when all the kids are perhaps in a hotel and they should be asleep. You know, do your staff know what you're expecting? Those many hours sort of either walking or sat on a floor, making sure that students are where they should be at night. Training for EpiPens. It is a very simple thing, but again, don't assume, don't have that expectation everybody knows how to do it, particularly when there's a child who might be in distress in front of you and you're trying to work out how to use an EpiPen. So it's all these sort of pre-visit checks with the staff that are going. Share the itineraries with them, have a talk to them. It might well be they've got information perhaps about some of the students that you'll be taking. Those pre-visit conversations, I think, are very, very, very valuable. And then finally, if you is a residential trip and you've got the joy of sorting rooms out, get the details from the venue, from the hotel, from the centre, whatever it might be, in advance. Think about like how many are in a room, but also things like what floors. So, you know, I've seen trips where and heard about trips, and I've been on a trip where they thought it was okay that the staff were on a completely different section, different floor to the girls and the boys who were all on the same floor. And it was like, no, that you don't want that to happen, and we can't let that happen. Um, so know in advance, it's not just so the students can work out who they want to share rooms with. It allows you, the whole point is that you can in advance know, right, I need to put a male member of staff on that floor, I need to put female member of staff on that floor, and so on. And that's, again, it's making the trip that bit easy by taking these decisions before you go. Right, during your trip, again, if it's a residential, take time while you're there for reflection. The kids will be being blasted with loads of information. And I think it's quite important to give them that opportunity at some point, at the end of the day, to recap. It might be during the evening meal. It might be on a coach journey back to the hotel, but perhaps highlighting, asking, well, what have we seen today? What did you enjoy? Why was that important? How does that link to what we were doing before we left school? Or how do you think that might feed into? Do you remember when we did that last assessment and it was all about, really trying to, for them to see that the purpose, I think, and for them also just to think about things they've really enjoyed that day and sharing it. And getting them to ask questions, because sometimes our students won't ask questions, particularly of site guides and experts that are there, because they're either too nervous, they think it might be rude, or for whatever reason, or they don't want to ask in front of other people. So encourage those questions so that you can provide those answers. So, then go to bed that night really sure about what they've seen, what they've heard, and what they've visited. Back to logistics. Please, if you're on a residential, don't let students stay in their rooms for too long. View student rooms as somewhere they sleep and they wash, and that's it. Downtime, it leads to students wandering around, boys going into girls' rooms and vice versa. Think carefully about evenings. Once you've done all your visits for that day and you've been to that museum, or you've been to that, in our case, we went to the volcano and to Vesuvius, what are you going to do in an evening? So either have planned activities. I know when we were in Rome, we used to take the kids out in an evening for a walk. They could go down to, the Trevi, they could fountain, they could go and buy an ice cream, but it was controlled and they weren't stuck in the hotel. When they do have that free time during the day, I always make sure that there's a very clear set of rules, and I am very clear from the start before the trip. If you're at the airport, before you're flying out, if when you're getting onto the coach, be very clear. It's not nagging, it's so they understand exactly where the line is. I would suggest having students in a minimum of 3 if they are wandering around independently for a little bit. If something happens, I don't know, if someone falls over, someone, God forbid, gets hit by a car, one can stay with that child and one can come and one can come and find a member of staff and explain what's going on. Students need to know where you are. Free time is lovely for everybody. It gives everybody a break, but a member of staff needs to be in a designated place. And I think students like that. They feel reassured. I think we assume that our kids are quite independent and they're all happy when they're away, but actually for a lot of students that they need to know where you are. Public transport. I've used the tube. I've used the tube in London. I've used public transport in Germany with students, and I use the tube in Rome. You've got to think about how you want to work that one. I think the students need to know exactly what to do if they do get off at the wrong station or the wrong stop. Touch wood, it's never happened to me. I've had a member of staff get off at the wrong stop, but certainly not students. But be clear, what do you want them to do? And this is particularly important if you are planning to use underground, because there might not be any phone service. So if they start panicking and they're trying to phone you and they've got no service, and they need a very clear understanding of what to do next. And that's really important. The other thing that I would say about tubes and buses, I would assume you already think about this, but break your group down into a smaller number. That small number is with one particular member of staff. They are watching that member of staff like a hawk. I mean, I've gone as far as, I get a little bit, stressed sometimes. Not stressed, but I try to look on the side of what can possibly go wrong. I've even had my staff chuck a yellow sort of t-shirt on for this sort of section of a trip, just to put it on, just so that they do stand out. I mean, we all looked, muppets, but we got these bright yellow t-shirts. All the kids could see these yellow t-shirts. If that yellow t-shirt started to sort of move towards a door, they knew, oh right, this is the stop. So again, that worked. As soon as we got off, and we're not in a busy place, you could take it off, shove it in a backpack. But it's these little things you want to think about. How can I make it easier? How can I reassure the students? How can I make sure they are exactly where I want them to be? End of the night on residentials, I always remind students about what their plan is for the following day, time for breakfast, what sort of clothing they might need, what they need to throw in their bags, like sun cream, hats, things like that. I also provide each room with residential with an itinerary, paper copy, so that they've got an idea as well, because otherwise you just get asked all the time, like, what are we doing tomorrow, what are we doing? You say, look at your itinerary, and it just gives you sometimes a bit of breathing space. Phone numbers, we take school mobiles, I know, away when we go on trips. I ask for student phone numbers at the pre-visit trip. I put them all onto the phone. I share, obviously, the school mobile with the kids. I make them put it onto their phone, and I make them show me, or my staff, that they have got it on their phones. I think that's really important for obvious reasons. Dividing groups into subgroups. I think that's probably common sense, but this idea of frequent head counts throughout the visit, so that we haven't lost one, or one's got so fascinated with something that they didn't carry on walking with the rest of us. And then finally, on residentials, make sure the students know where the staff rooms are because of emergencies. Make sure that male staff stick to checking boys' rooms, whether it's for tidiness, whether it's to bellow at someone that they need to start moving and not be asleep in the morning, and for female staff to be checking girls' rooms. Right, and after the trip, so it's all over. We've got back. We took 40 students, and we've got 40 students back. What do we do? Definitely produce some kind of evaluation or feedback opportunity for the students that went, but also for the staff that went. It could be verbal, it could be written, it could be conducted online. It's useful, it really is. Getting feedback from parents and carers on how they felt the trip impacts on their children, whether they felt it was value for money, financially, but also, was it value for time? Their students, their children have been perhaps out of school for a week. That's an awful lot of learning time. Do they think it was of value? Ask them also about things like quality of communication regarding the trip. Was the way the letters sent out, was it? Could there be things that could be improved? Pre-visit meetings that they might have attended. How do you feel? Really think about, how could I make my next visit better? Feed those student experience, knowledge, understanding back into your curriculum as you planned. If you've prepped them before you went, you've been on the trip, you want to do something because of the trip afterwards. Think about how students that did go on trips can share those experiences. It could be an article for the school website. If you've got a newsletter, it could be a display board with thoughts and photos. It's great for those students to sort of give back, but also it's a chance, obviously, to raise the profile of the trips that History are running, and that it sort of helps for the next time that you want to raise interest. This is something that I did at my last school, that I worked at, when I'd arranged a trip, I got some of the students that had gone along, and asked if some of them would go to a governors meeting, because our governors had to sign off on all the residential trips. And I had a couple of students who went along to the governors meeting and described the trip to the governors. And, said, thank you for letting us go. And let us tell you all about it. Let's tell you what we think we got from it. What we find valuable about that experience. And it was great for the students, for the kids to actually meet the governors and to understand what the governors do, because they don't meet governors very often, if at all. And it was great for the governors to see the impact of the trip that you'd put forward to them, whatever months or a year beforehand. And it was really lovely. It was a really lovely experience to see these students really passionate about this trip, and for the governors to be sat there going, oh, we're really glad that you got that opportunity. Travel companies provide feedback. They need it to make trips either for you in the future better, or for other people who be running trips. And don't be polite if there's things that you felt they let you down on. Talk to them about it, and set out perhaps what you'd hoped and perhaps what they'd given you. And then finally, go back to your desired outcomes. Think about the trip and what you've done. Would you run that trip again compared to the outcomes that you set out with? Do you think that there would be any changes required? Do you think you need to amend how it sits within your curriculum? Did the students of all abilities find that trip accessible? So thinking about that feedback that you get from your students, you'll know that some of those students perhaps have SEND issues, have mobility issues. What's their particular feedback? Is it different to everybody else's? And if it is, how so? And I think that's really, that depth of understanding about how different groupings found that trip, found that field visit, are really important. And that's not just for residentials, that's if you take them out for the day. How could I change that trip? How do I need to change that trip? How has that helped specific groups? I think they're really quite powerful questions that you need to ask yourself. So that's it. I hope that's been of use. I hope that's been of value to you. Trips are not easy. They are hard work. They sometimes you might feel that they are breaking you, but those of you that have run trips or been on trips, we also know that the understanding of a place, the joy of seeing children going to the sites that you've organised. It might sound a bit cheesy, but it is awesome. I remember the first time I took students to Rome, and we walked up the steps of the Colosseum inside, and then it flattens and you look out over the arena, and it was like, whoa, these kids they might be cynical about life, they might be all about social media, but you take them to some of these places that we teach in history, and it's an absolutely brilliant moment. And then you carry that with you, and then you think, oh, I'll do another trip next year because it was so much fun. So again, I hope this has been useful to you. I would very much advocate trips, but I would also advocate the fact that they are hard work. They are really hard work, and we are perhaps even busier now than we've ever been as teachers, and you need to take that into account. And the only other thing that I would say is, as much preparation in advance as possible. Try and make the actual visit itself, I won't say it's easy, but just try and make it as less stressful as you can through the preparation that you put in advance. Okay, well, thank you very much for listening and watching. I am wishing you all the best for any future trips that you might be running. Thank you.